King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. That's about 75 feet, or about 20 meters, 25 meters. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was the hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own."
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really good to be with you today. And what an exciting story. Thank you for reading it so well, David. It was really evocative and helpful to read it like that. It's amazing how God brings things together too. Like Joe was saying earlier, we didn't actually talk in advance about the songs that we're singing today, but they're all just right. And what Kirsty gave us today also fitted really well. It's amazing how God can do that sort of thing. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised, but it always takes me aback. One of the reasons that I chose this passage today was because of the song that we had at the beginning. It's a song that Ray had us listen to a while ago, and it really spoke to me, and I've played it a number of times since then. And the song is Even If, and that is the sort of center of what I want to talk about today, and why I'm going to talk about this particular passage. I think it's one of the most exciting stories in the Bible, and I'm sure you remember from when you were a child hearing this story told, and maybe somebody building up the tension about what was going to happen to them. And it's a fantastic story, an amazing story of God delivering, as Kirsty reminded us. And it's no wonder that we tell our children about it, and we can remember it ourselves. The date of the book is really interesting because it's the only time that we have this kind of situation talked about properly in the Bible. If we go to chapter 1 and the first 2 verses, it's linked to an account in 2 Kings 24, where Jehoiakim is made a vassal of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And Jehoiakim's really foolish, because after 3 years of serving him as his vassal, doing what he was told to do by Nebuchadnezzar, he decides to rebel. And that's never a good idea when you're dealing with an autocrat like Nebuchadnezzar. And what happens after 3 years is that this rebellion leads to the Babylonians coming into Jerusalem, and with other people. It says in 2 Kings 24 that the Babylonians, the Arameans, the Moabite, and the Ammonite raiders all come in. A big army come in to Jerusalem, and they destroy Judah, and they take the gold from the temple. Now, this is just the first time it happens, and that's really all that we have in 2 Kings. But when we look at this passage and all the events in Daniel, we see that actually he also took some very prominent, possibly royal people as well to Babylon. And God did that. God allowed the Babylonians to do that because of the sin of the people, because of what they did. And this was round about 604 BC, which is quite a long time before the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC. So we're talking about an event that happened even before the Babylonians were very strong and able to come and destroy completely Jerusalem. It's really helpful, therefore, to have this account, because then we can see something very important that's happening. One of the interesting things that we notice with it is that taking men like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, taking Daniel there, was to make it possible to benefit the Babylonians as well. They didn't just take odd people. They were taking very gifted, actually handsome men as well. For some reason, that seemed to be important to the Babylonian king. And it also takes into account that the Babylonians wanted to make them Babylonian. They wanted them to be like them and to learn all the things about them. So they had in this picture, we see a handsome young man, a bit like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, who were gifted, who were handsome, who were noble men, who could serve with distinction in the court. They not only learned about the ways of the Babylonians, they not only dressed like them, but they actually seemed to serve with distinction because they were promoted at various times in the passage that we're looking at and others in the book of Daniel. And although they had Babylonian names, although they dressed like Babylonians, although they were trained for 3 years in how to be in the king's service, they never compromised their faith in Yahweh, in the God of their fathers. Even though they were in exile and they were thousands of miles away from their homes, their families, the things that they knew, they didn't blame God for it. They didn't stop worshiping him. They continued to worship him even in exile. And we see that in the first chapter, where they wouldn't eat the food from the king's table. That was one of the privileges of the position that they were in, that they were able to eat from the king's table and eat nutritious, good food. But they wouldn't do it. And the reason they wouldn't do it probably is because perhaps that food had been sacrificed to idols already before it was given to the king. Or perhaps it broke the laws that God had given them about the kind of food that they would eat. And this seems to be early on in the time that they were serving at the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. They weren't prepared to compromise. They weren't prepared to do what the Babylonians did on things that were important to them and what God had told them not to do. But in this account in chapter 3, we see them in an even more serious situation. Because this is a life or death situation. And here Nebuchadnezzar orders them to worship this gold statue which he had built. An enormous statue that was probably seen for miles around. Some of the astrologers of the court, some of those who looked at the stars and made predictions about the future, they had been watching Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we see that as a theme throughout the book. These men are being watched. And they noticed that they wouldn't worship the statue. And they reported it to the king. Naturally, the king was angry. It seems like autocrats are always angry. And this was the case here. He said that they had to worship this statue. And if they didn't, they would be thrown into a blazing furnace. So it wasn't just a little fire. This was something really nasty. So it was a very serious situation that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego found themselves in. But again, they didn't compromise. They weren't prepared to compromise their faith. They would only worship the one true God, Yahweh. They wouldn't worship the giant statue. They wouldn't worship the gods of the Babylonians. They would adapt to living in Babylon by wearing the clothes that they wore, doing the things that they did there, but they would not worship any god but Yahweh, but God himself. So they wouldn't worship the giant statue. And when everybody else was listening to all these musical instruments, must have made quite a sound. They weren't going to bow down and worship this statue. They would only worship God, whatever the consequence was. So when they were brought before the king himself, he was absolutely furious with them. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So notice what he was saying. He was giving them another chance. And still, they wouldn't budge. And in response, these men say something really fascinating, something extraordinary. They speak to Nebuchadnezzar respectfully but firmly. They say, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you on this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve will be able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Notice the respect, but they were determined. They weren't going to worship whatever god the Babylonians worshipped. They weren't going to worship this statue. They were only going to worship God. And they had faith in him that he could deliver them. But even if he didn't, they wouldn't worship this statue. I think in that statement we see a sense of peace in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That they were at peace in the decision that they made, that they were trusting God for whatever happened. And they knew that whatever happened would be the right thing. They wouldn't worship the God of the Babylonians, even if it meant being thrown into the blazing furnace. And they believed that God could deliver them. Not surprisingly, this response infuriates the king. And he makes the blazing furnace even hotter. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are bound by big ropes and thrown in. And it was so hot that it killed the soldiers who were throwing them in. I always feel sorry for these poor soldiers who were just obeying the orders. But as they looked, there must have been a door in the furnace or something. They could not only see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walking around unbound and unharmed, but there seemed to be another figure with them. And on seeing this, Nebuchadnezzar approaches the furnace and commands Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out. He calls them the servants of the Most High God. Something's happening in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. And all the officials gathered round Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and noticed that they were completely unharmed and they didn't even smell of smoke. Their clothes weren't singed. There was nothing any different about them than when they'd gone in. Nebuchadnezzar's response is interesting. His attitude to the three men is different. He says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve the other gods except for God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut to pieces." He loved horrible deaths. "And their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." No other God can save in this way. He was so impressed by what the three men and their God had done in defying his orders and saying what they did and doing what happened, in doing something that would get them horribly killed. And so he says, no other God can save in this way. And in doing that, he goes on to promote Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, it's a very familiar story. It's a story that we've learned for many years, I'm sure. But it's an amazing story because they stand firm in their faith. They're determined not to budge because of the things that they see as important. And it shows how powerful their testimony is in the face of a place that's the most pagan place that you could think of. And I think what we can learn from this is that we can see that they show us how we can live in a way that's not compromised. When we're in that sort of situation, we can see that we wouldn't compromise because of the fact that they don't. We might not have a big gold statue that we're told to worship, but there are lots of things in society which seem to suggest that we should be compromising our faith. Things that are helping us to see life in a different way than what the Bible suggests. So things like sexual ethics today, the sanctity of life, which we've seen being threatened by laws in these days, materialism. We can all be pressured by them and look at the values of the world rather than the values that are in the Bible. And I think there's even more pressure today than there was, certainly when I was younger, because of things like social media and television and so on. There's so much pressure on people to conform. But Romans 12 and verse 2 says something helpful about this. And this is the NLT version of this verse. It says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. We might end up like this little purple duck there. We might stand out in the crowd. But that is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, and what we are sometimes asked to do. God isn't in the business of helping us to conform to the patterns of this world, being like other people. He's in the business of transforming us into the likeness of Jesus. He's in the business of making us different, that we need to stand out because of what he is doing in our lives. John Lennox has written a really fantastic wee book called Against the Flow. Actually, it's not very wee, it's quite big. And there's a fantastic chapter on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it's really because of them and because of what Daniel does that he gives the book the title, Against the Flow. Because they are living in a very alien society and they are doing something that other people don't do. And they're showing just how important God is to them. And they're very much against the flow. They're not going to compromise in what they believe. So this narrative also challenges us to think about the things that might rival God in our lives, that might make us turn away from God. And Kirsty was talking about that earlier. The fact that things like our possessions, the things that we want to have, or the activities that we do in our leisure time can become more important. And these are just two examples. They can be more important to us than God. They can take his place. And it can sometimes be literally take his place. Rather than spending time praying, we can be doing one of these things. I fall into that trap myself. I'm talking to myself as much as to you. We need to remember to put God first. To think about what he wants for us. To think about the things that are important to us. And I think we have this challenge from this passage. What things are more important to us than God? or what things could be more important to us than God. But like I said at the beginning, the aspect of this passage which I think is most important for me is the whole idea of even if, and the even if statement that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego make here in verse 18. They know that God is able to save them. They know that he has the power to do that. They know that they serve a powerful and a magnificent God, and that if he chooses to save them, then that's fine. But they say, but even if he doesn't, they're not going to worship the other gods. Now, I was thinking about that logically, and I thought they would be dead if that happened. If God didn't save them, they would be dead, and they would be probably in heaven worshiping him. But what they're really saying here is that even if the worst happens in terms of human things that people can do, even if Nebuchadnezzar does the worst that he can, they're not going to worship any other god but Yahweh. Now that is showing, I know we know this story well, but when you think about it, they were in front of this blazing furnace, in front of this powerful king, with all these people round about at them. And they would not budge on this. They would not worship any other god, even on pain of death. And not just any old death, a horrible, foul death. They showed incredible faith, and they had peace about it. They knew it was the right thing to do. They knew this was what they wanted to do and what God wanted them to do. And it reminded me, as I was preparing for this, of the situation when Simon Peter said something really important to Jesus. At a time when a lot of the disciples were leaving, not the close disciples, but the people on the more periphery of his discipleship group. And Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Are you going to leave me as well?" And he said, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." There's no one else to go to. We've found somebody who makes all the difference in our lives, who gives us the promise of heaven, who gives us hope, who gives us peace, who loves us. Why would we desert him when all the other things are rubbish compared with that? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Simon Peter knew what it was to follow the one that they loved, the one that they served. That was the way that they would be truly saved, was to serve this God. And I was also thinking of the book of Habakkuk and the last wee bit of the book, which is one of my favorite passages. And it says that even if the worst happens, even if the Babylonians come, and it's probably about the same time as this passage in Daniel, even if the Babylonians come and completely destroy everything, he's going to still cling to God. He will still be joyful in God, his Savior. And I know that many of you are facing challenging times just now. I know that for many of you, you're facing health issues or health issues within your families, or you've lost loved ones recently, or your relationships and your finances are in a bit of a difficult time. And I think this message here is to say, cling to God. And even if the worst happens, cling to him even tighter. Because that is when you need him even more. I was struck by their faith, but also, as I've said already, their peace. And I know in talking to some people here that in times when things have been really hard, against nature almost, you feel peaceful as well. You know God is with you. You know that he has got the answer. And in Psalm 46 in verse 1, it says, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. Wonderful words. And this gets me to the fourth figure in the blazing furnace. What a glorious picture. Because I think this perfectly illustrates something that we take for granted almost, and we say sometimes in a bit of a relaxed, blasé kind of way. King Nebuchadnezzar saw this figure. I think that's quite extraordinary that he, the king, a pagan, saw this. And he thinks it might be an angel. He talks about it as a son of the gods. Some people would suggest this was the pre-incarnate Jesus. He was with them. God was with them. He didn't leave them to go through this horrible experience of being thrown in the fire alone. He was with them, and he was going through it with them. And it just struck me again as I was reading this, what a beautiful illustration it is of God being with us. That when we go through really, really hard times, he is there. When we're frightened, when we're challenged by situations in life, when we're going through a fiery furnace type of scenario, he is there with us, going through it with us. He doesn't leave us on our own. And that is such a beautiful picture of that God is there with us. Absolutely wonderful. And the God of Shadrach and Meshach did the impossible. Now, that escaped me. I was so busy thinking about the even if bit and all the other stuff. And it made me realize, again, how amazing it is. And yet also, this is our God who can do the impossible. It was humanly impossible for these men to survive this fire. The men that threw them in were killed. It was absolutely impossible, and yet God did it. He saved them from the fire. And it seems that because of this, when we look at it, we see what happened here. That it didn't just show Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego who they were serving. It also showed this king, Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan king, and the whole court. Everybody in Babylon would have been talking about it. Nebuchadnezzar recognized who this God was. That he was a powerful God. Now, I'm always a bit interested in what happens with Nebuchadnezzar, because in chapter 2, he has this dream which Daniel interprets. And he has to go through this horrible situation. And he seems to have some sort of faith. And again, here, he almost has faith in God, but not quite. And I think he's in many ways one of the saddest figures in the Bible, because he doesn't quite accept God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But he recognizes what he has done, and he says that who he is. And he tells people that they've to worship him. He is the same God, the God who saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's the same God as we serve. He's not changed. He's still the same today. He can still do amazing things. He is doing amazing things in our church, in our personal lives, in the world that we're living in. Something that just struck me a wee while ago was the fact that, lots of people are coming to know God from a generation that just rejected him before. When I was that age, in my 20s or so, a lot of my friends wouldn't have anything to do with God. And people of that sort of age now are turning to him. Who would have believed that? God is doing amazing things in these days. He's doing amazing things in our lives as well. And because of the testimony of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how God saved them from the blazing furnace. God was glorified. God is glorified in this church as we see growth, as we see people coming to know him. God is glorified as he takes us through difficult times, and we thrive in that rather than being destroyed by it. It's a bit like what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 9, that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. And as we rely on God's grace to live in our lives in the way that God wants us to, then he is the one who gets all the glory. I know, as I've said before, many of you have these kind of experiences, that God is glorified through what you've experienced and what you're going through, because you're able to do things and experience things and bear things that are very painful and difficult. And that's our testimony. And so I'd like to encourage you. Be encouraged when you're going through difficult times. And it's hard. It's very hard. And yet, God is saying to you, I am glorified through your weakness. My power is made perfect in your weakness. And I give you the grace to go through it. So the passage today that we've looked at it's a wonderful example of what God can do in people's lives, and how strong the testimony of somebody who follows God can be when they don't compromise, when they don't worship or put first anything other than God. God can do amazing things. And may our lives glorify him. And may we know his presence and his help in times of trouble.